At 73, Joseph Davis slept beneath a collapsing barn roof, his breath turning to mist in the cold Kentucky air while the town laughed at what they called his final mistake. A man who once built homes, now hiding inside one that could barely stand. They mocked him at the diner, whispered at church. Even his own son had walked away. But Joseph never argued, because he knew something they didn't. And on the morning he'd finally pried open the warped wooden doors before a crowd of curious onlookers. What lay inside didn't just silence them. It rewrote everything they thought they knew about him, and about that forgotten barn. If you've ever been judged too quickly, stay with this story. Long before the cold crept into his bones and the silence of the countryside became his only companion, Joseph Davis had lived a life built with his own hands, steady, honest, and quietly proud. In Detroit, Joseph was known not by wealth or status, but by the things he left behind: solid oak staircases, hand-carved cabinets, porches that never creaked even after 20 winters. People trusted his work because Joseph never cut corners. Not in wood, not in life. But the world he built began to fracture the day his wife, Eleanor, passed away. The house they had shared for over 40 years filled with the smell of varnish cinnamon tea, and laughter that echoed through Sunday mornings fell unbearably quiet. Joseph still woke up at dawn out of habit, still made 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was no one left to share it with. Grief did not arrive loudly for Joseph. It settled in slowly like dust, layer by layer, until everything felt heavier. And then came Ryan. Ryan Davis had always been ambitious. Even as a boy, he didn't care much for the patience required in woodworking. He wanted faster results, bigger outcomes. He spoke in numbers, investments, opportunities, words Joseph never fully understood, but tried to respect. At first, Ryan visited more often after Eleanor's death. He brought groceries, paid bills Joseph forgot, talked about helping manage things. Joseph, worn down by loss and loneliness, mistook control for care. "I just don't want you to struggle," Dad Ryan had said one evening, sliding a set of papers across the kitchen table. His voice was calm, reassuring. "This is just to make things easier. Temporary. I'll handle the finances, the taxes, everything." Joseph didn't read every page. He trusted his son. He signed. For a few weeks, nothing seemed different. Ryan continued visiting, continued smiling. But then the changes came quiet at first. A new lock on the mailbox. A real estate agent stopping by just to check things. Then one morning, Joseph found a letter taped to his front door. Eviction notice. He stood there for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands. His mind struggled to catch up with the words in front of him. Eviction. From his own home. When Ryan finally answered the phone, his tone was different, colder, distant. "You signed the transfer, Dad," he said flatly. "The house is mine now. I already sold it. You can't maintain it anyway." Joseph's chest tightened, not from anger, but from something deeper, something quieter. A kind of breaking. "I thought," Joseph began, but the sentence never finished. Ryan sighed, impatient. "You'll figure something out. There are senior facilities. It's better this way." The line went dead. Joseph didn't cry. He simply walked back inside, sat down at the kitchen table where he had signed those papers, and placed his hand over the worn wood surface he had sanded himself decades ago. For the first time in his life, he realized something painful. Not everything built with love could be protected by it. Within 2 weeks, Joseph packed what little he could carry. A toolbox, a few photographs, Eleanor's old scarf. Everything else, every chair, every beam, every memory etched into the walls, was left behind for strangers to claim. Detroit no longer felt like home. It felt like a place that had erased him. So Joseph left. He didn't announce it, didn't say goodbye. He simply boarded a bus heading south toward a place he had never seen, but somehow felt drawn to rural Kentucky. The journey was long and quiet. Fields replaced buildings. Silence replaced traffic. And for the first time in months, Joseph could hear something other than his own thoughts. When he stepped off the bus near a small, fading town surrounded by open land and distant hills, no one was waiting for him. There were no familiar faces. No second chances waiting neatly arranged. Just wind, just space, just the unknown, just the... Joseph walked slowly along the roadside, his toolbox growing heavier with each step. Not because of its weight, but because of everything it represented. A past he couldn't return to. A life that had been taken from him not by strangers, but by blood. And yet beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter. A refusal. Joseph Davis had lost his home. He had lost his wife. He had lost the trust he once placed in his own son. But he had not lost the one thing no one had ever given him: his ability to build. And somewhere deep within that unfamiliar land, something waited. Not just shelter, not just survival, but a chance, however fragile, to build again. He didn't know it yet, but the broken path that had led him here was about to uncover something no one else had seen in decades. The first time Joseph Davis saw the barn on Hollow Creek Road, he almost kept walking. It leaned slightly to one side, as if exhausted from holding itself up for too many years. The wooden planks were sun-bleached and split the roof sagging in the middle like a tired spine. One of the large front doors hung crooked, its rusted hinges groaning whenever the wind pushed against it. To most people, it looked like a place waiting to collapse. To Joseph, it looked like something that hadn't given up yet. He stood there for a long moment, gripping the handle of his worn toolbox, his eyes tracing every fracture, every warped beam, every missing nail. Where others would have seen decay, Joseph saw structure. Where others saw abandonment, he saw possibility. And perhaps more than anything, he saw himself. "You're not seriously thinking about staying there, are you?" The voice came from behind him, soft, but edged with disbelief. Joseph turned to see an older woman standing a few yards away. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat. Despite the mild afternoon, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. Her posture was straight, but her eyes carried a quiet weariness. "I'm Margaret Holloway," she said, stepping closer. "That barn belongs to me. Or what's left of it, anyway." Joseph nodded politely. Joseph Davis. Joseph. Margaret glanced at the structure again, then back at him. "It's not fit for living. Roof leaks when it rains. Floors uneven. No proper insulation. I've been meaning to tear it down for years." Joseph looked at the barn, again, this time more carefully. "May I take a look inside?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, not because she feared what he might find, but because she already knew. Still, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small ring of keys. "If you insist," she said, handing them over. The moment Joseph pushed the door open, it let out a long, aching creak, as if announcing his arrival after years of silence. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by thin beams of sunlight slipping through cracks in the walls. The smell of old hay and damp wood filled the space. Broken tools lay scattered in one corner, long forgotten. The loft above sagged slightly, its railing barely intact. Joseph stepped inside slowly, his boots crunching against debris. He didn't speak. He simply observed. His eyes moved with quiet precision, measuring distances, assessing joints, tracing the path of load-bearing beams. His fingers brushed against the wood, feeling its texture, its strength, its weaknesses. Margaret watched him from the doorway, arms folded. "You're not the first man to walk in there thinking he could fix it," she said. They all walked out the same way. Joseph didn't turn. "They weren't builders," he replied calmly. There was no arrogance in his voice, just certainty. After a few more minutes, he stepped back outside and handed her the keys. How much he asked. Margaret blinked. "Excuse me to stay here," Joseph clarified. "I don't need much, just a place to work. I can fix what I use." Margaret studied him carefully now. His clothes were worn but clean. His hands were rough but steady. His eyes, they weren't desperate, they were determined. "You don't look like a man who belongs in a place like that," she said quietly. Joseph gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Neither does it." For a moment something flickered across Margaret's face, something like recognition. Or maybe respect. "It's not worth much," she said after a pause. "You can stay for $50 a month, but I won't take responsibility if that place falls on you." Joseph nodded. "Fair enough?" They shook hands, and just like that, the broken barn had a new occupant. Word spread quickly. Small towns have a way of noticing everything, especially things that don't quite fit. By the next morning, people had already begun talking. "Did you hear about the old guy living in Holloway's barn? Man's gotta be crazy. Probably got nowhere else to go." At the local diner, laughter followed the story like a shadow. "Heard he thinks he can fix that place," one man chuckled, stirring his coffee. "Thing's been rotting for 30 years. Another leaned back in his chair. "Some folks just don't know when to quit." Among them sat a man who didn't laugh. Douglas Whitaker. Unlike the others, Douglas didn't see the situation as entertainment. He saw it as inconvenient. His eyes narrowed slightly as he listened, his fingers tapping against the table. "Which barn?" he asked. "Hollow Creek Road," someone replied. "Margaret Holloway's old property." Douglas went still for a fraction of a second. Then he forced a casual nod. "Huh." But inside something shifted, because that land, that forgotten, worthless stretch everyone dismissed, wasn't as meaningless as they thought. And now someone was living on it. Joseph ignored the whispers. He had learned long ago that noise didn't build anything. Work did. The first night in the barn was cold. Wind slipped through the cracks like an uninvited guest. The floor creaked beneath him. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. Joseph lay on a thin blanket, staring up at the broken beams above. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it was his. And for the first time since leaving Detroit, that meant something. The next morning he got to work. He didn't rush. He didn't try to fix everything at once. He started small, reinforcing a loose beam, replacing a rusted nail, clearing debris from the floor. Each action was deliberate, measured, patient, the kind of work that didn't demand attention but earned it over time. Days turned into weeks. Blisters formed on his hands, then hardened into calluses. His back ached. His breath fogged in the cold mornings. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the barn began to change. The crooked door stood a little straighter. The floor held a little firmer. The space felt less abandoned. Margaret noticed first. She would occasionally walk by, pretending she had business elsewhere, but her eyes always drifted toward the barn. One afternoon she stopped at the edge of the property. "You've done more in 2 weeks than anyone else did in years," she said. Joseph wiped his hands on a rag. It just needed someone to listen. Margaret frowned slightly. "Listen to what it's trying to be," Joseph replied. She didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. Not everyone was impressed. One afternoon, as Joseph carried a stack of salvaged wood toward the barn, a pickup truck slowed beside him. The window rolled down. A man leaned out, smirking. "You planning to build a mansion out of that junk?" he called. Laughter followed from inside the truck. Joseph didn't stop walking, didn't respond, didn't even look up. Because he had already learned something important. People who mock what's broken rarely understand what it takes to rebuild it. But somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the quiet determination, beyond the slow transformation of wood and nails, something else was waiting, something hidden, something buried not just beneath the structure, but within its history. Joseph didn't know it yet, but every board he lifted, every nail he replaced, every step he took deeper into that barn was bringing him closer. Not just to rebuilding a place to live, but to uncovering a truth no one else had bothered to see. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper, more confident, more comfortable as the days passed, and Joseph Davis continued living in the ruined barn on Hollow Creek Road. In a town where nothing much changed, he had become something of a spectacle. At the small grocery store on Main Street, conversations would hush for a moment when he walked in, then resume in low, amused tones as he passed by the aisles. "Still fixing that place?" a cashier once asked her, smile thinly veiled with curiosity. Joseph nodded. "Piece by piece." She chuckled. "Well, you've got time, I guess." It wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't kind either. At church, the whispers felt heavier. Joseph hadn't planned to go that Sunday, but something in him, a habit perhaps, or a need for quiet, guided him to the worn wooden doors of the small, white chapel just outside town. As he stepped inside, heads turned. He could feel it before he saw it. Eyes scanning his worn jacket, his scuffed boots, the faint scent of sawdust that clung to him no matter how hard he tried to wash it away. He chose a seat near the back, listened, sang when the hymns came, but the sense of belonging he once knew, it didn't follow him here. After the service, a group gathered outside beneath the pale sunlight. Laughter rang through the air, easy, familiar laughter, until Joseph stepped closer. Then it shifted. Not silence, just something else. "Well, if it isn't the barn man," someone muttered under their breath. A few chuckles followed. Joseph kept walking. He had learned slowly but surely that dignity didn't come from being accepted. It came from not needing to be. But not everyone watched him with amusement. Some watched with intent. From across the street, leaning casually against his polished black truck, Douglas Whitaker observed Joseph with a quiet, calculating gaze. Douglas was the kind of man who understood value, not sentimental value, not emotional worth, but real, tangible, measurable gain. Land, ownership, opportunity. And there was something about that barn, something about that specific piece of land that had caught his attention long before Joseph arrived. For years he had tried to convince Margaret Holloway to sell it. For years she had refused. Now suddenly an outsider was living there, fixing it, staying. That wasn't random. Douglas didn't believe in random. He believed in patterns, and this one didn't sit right with him. 3 days later, Joseph found him standing just outside the barn. "Well," Douglas said, glancing up at the structure with a faint smirk, "you've made some improvements." Joseph stepped out slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Just doing what I can." Douglas nodded, walking a slow circle around the barn, his shoes crunching against gravel. "You know," he continued, "this land's not really worth much. Too far from town. Soil's not great. Structure's barely standing." Joseph didn't respond. He had heard variations of that argument before. Douglas stopped in front of him. "I'd be willing to take it off your hands," he said casually. "Make things easier for you. Give you a little cash. Enough to get you somewhere. More comfortable." Joseph met his gaze. "It's not mine to sell," he said calmly. Douglas smiled thinly. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Davis. Just a matter of price." Joseph shook his head. "Not everything." For a moment something flickered in Douglas's eyes, irritation perhaps, or surprise. Then it was gone. "Well," he said lightly, turning back toward his truck offer stands, "just in case you come to your senses." As the engine roared to life and the truck pulled away, Joseph stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle in its wake. He didn't fully understand why, but something about that conversation felt wrong. The next sign came that same evening. Joseph had just finished reinforcing a section of the barn wall when he noticed something unusual near the edge of the property. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. Deeper than usual. They didn't belong to Margaret's old sedan, and they hadn't been there that morning. He crouched slightly, running his fingers along the indentation in the dirt. Heavy vehicle. Recent. Uninvited. Joseph straightened slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land around him stretched wide and quiet, but now it didn't feel quite as empty as before. A few days later, Ryan Davis arrived. Joseph didn't expect it, didn't want it. But there he was, stepping out of a sleek rental car that looked painfully out of place against the rural backdrop. He wore a tailored coat, polished shoes, the faint scent of expensive cologne. Everything about him spoke of a world Joseph no longer belonged to. Dad Ryan called out, forcing a smile as he approached. Joseph didn't return it. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Ryan glanced at the barn, his expression tightening for just a moment before smoothing out again. "I've been looking for you," he said. "You just disappeared." Joseph folded his arms. "You knew where I was." Ryan hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "I heard things. Thought I should check in." Silence stretched between them, heavy, unresolved. Finally, Ryan sighed. "Look, Dad," he said, lowering his voice. "I know things didn't go smoothly back in Detroit, but what's done is done. I'm trying to help you now." Joseph's jaw tightened slightly. "Help me," he repeated. Ryan nodded quickly. "Yeah, I mean this." He gestured towards the barn. "You can't seriously think this is a solution." Joseph didn't answer, because deep down he knew something Ryan didn't. This wasn't about the barn. It wasn't about survival. It was about starting over. And that was something Ryan had never had to do. "I found a place for you." Ryan continued pulling out his phone. "A senior community. Clean, safe meals included. You'd be comfortable." Joseph looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No." Ryan blinked. "No, I'm staying here." Frustration flickered across Ryan's face. "Dad, be reasonable. I am." "This is insane!" Ryan snapped, his voice rising. "You're living in a collapsing barn in the middle of nowhere." "For what?" Joseph stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "For something you wouldn't understand." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Try me." Joseph held his gaze. "It's mine." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something Ryan had taken and never truly given back. Ownership, dignity, choice. Ryan's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "And when this place falls apart, don't expect me to come pick up the pieces." Joseph didn't respond. He didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one falling apart. Ryan turned sharply, walking back to his car. The engine started. The dust rose again. And just like that, he was gone. But the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was clearer, sharper, more revealing. Because now Joseph understood something he hadn't fully seen before. Ryan hadn't come out of concern. He had come out of interest. Just like Douglas. Different faces. Same intention. And suddenly the barn didn't feel like just a place to rebuild. It felt like something else entirely. Something people wanted. Something people were willing to lie for. Maybe even fight for. Joseph turned slowly, his eyes drifting back toward the structure. Toward the walls he had begun to restore. Toward the floor beneath his feet. And for the first time, he didn't just see what was broken. He wondered what was hidden. The first time Joseph noticed the loose floorboard, he almost ignored it. It was late afternoon, and the fading Kentucky light stretched long shadows across the barn's uneven floor. He had been working for hours, reinforcing a weakened beam near the back wall, his hands aching, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. The kind of exhaustion that usually told a man to stop. But Joseph had never been the kind to stop halfway through something that felt unfinished. As he stepped back to examine his work, his boot pressed down on a plank that responded differently from the others. A faint, hollow sound, Not the dull, solid resistance of wood anchored firmly in place, but something softer. Something uncertain. Joseph paused. Shifted his weight again. The same sound, subtle, almost unnoticeable. To anyone else it would have meant nothing. To Joseph it meant everything. He crouched slowly, brushing away dust and fragments of old hay. The plank looked like the others, weathered, worn, unremarkable. But as his fingers traced its edges, he felt it. A slight give. Not rot. Not damage. Movement. Joseph leaned back on his heels, studying it carefully. There were no visible hinges, no handle, no markings to suggest intention, and yet it didn't belong. He reached for his toolbox and pulled out a flat pry bar, the metal catching a faint glint of light. For a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of instinct, because something in him understood that whatever lay beneath that plank might change things. Still, Joseph slid the edge of the tool into the narrow gap and applied gentle pressure. The wood resisted at first, old, stubborn, unwilling to yield. Then slowly, it lifted. A small cloud of dust rose into the air as the plank gave way, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath. Joseph set the board aside and leaned closer, peering into the opening. At first he saw nothing but shadow. Then his eyes adjusted, and shapes began to form. Not empty, not forgotten. Stored, deliberately, carefully. Joseph reached inside his fingers, brushing against something dry and brittle. Paper. He pulled it out slowly, handling it with the kind of care reserved for things that didn't belong to the present. It was a bundle of letters tied together with a faded strip of cloth. The edges were yellowed, fragile with age, but the writing, though faint, was still visible. Joseph unfolded the top letter, his brow furrowing, as he tried to make out the script. It wasn't modern. The language was formal, the ink slightly smudged but legible. Names, dates, locations. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know one thing. These weren't ordinary letters. He set them aside gently and reached back into the hidden space. This time his hand found something heavier. Metal. Cold, despite the warmth of the day. Joseph pulled it free, revealing a set of tools, old handcrafted, worn by years of use. Not the kind you'd find in a store, not even the kind most modern carpenters would recognize. These were different, personal, each handle shaped slightly differently. Each blade bearing subtle marks of a craftsman who had known his work intimately. Joseph turned one over in his hands, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, the balance of the weight. These weren't made to be sold, he murmured quietly. They were made to be used. He set the tools down beside the letters, his curiosity deepening. The space beneath the floorboard extended farther than he had expected. Not just a small compartment, but a narrow, hidden cavity running along the length of the barn's interior. Joseph reached in again. This time his hand brushed against something rolled. He carefully pulled it out. A map. Old. Fragile. But unmistakably detailed. Lines drawn with precision. Markings indicating paths, boundaries. And something else. Routes. Joseph's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied it. The layout didn't match modern property lines. It showed something older, something that had existed before the land had been divided and claimed, before records had been simplified, before history had been rewritten. He swallowed slowly, setting the map down beside the other items. Then finally his hand found something different. A book, thicker than the letters, heavier. Bound in worn leather, its surface cracked but intact. Joseph lifted it carefully, brushing away the dust that had settled over decades, maybe longer. He hesitated only a moment before opening it. The first page was blank. The second wasn't. Ink. Faded but steady. Handwritten, a journal. Joseph leaned closer, reading slowly. The entries were dated far older than anything he had expected. Names he didn't recognize. Events he couldn't fully place. But patterns, Patterns he understood, movements, shelter, secrecy. This wasn't just a record of daily life. It was documentation, careful, intentional, hidden. Joseph turned another page, then another. Each entry revealed fragments of something larger, something that had been deliberately kept out of sight. Not lost, not forgotten. Hidden. For a reason. He sat back slowly, the weight of the discovery settling into him. This barn. This broken, abandoned structure that no one wanted. Was never just a barn. It had been something else. Something important. Something protected. And suddenly everything began to feel different. The interest. From Douglas. Ryan's sudden reappearance. The tire tracks. The urgency hidden beneath casual offers. They weren't random. They were connected. Joseph looked around the barn, his eyes tracing the beams, the walls, the structure he had begun to restore. He had come here with nothing. No plan, no expectation. Just a need to build something again. But now, it felt like he had stepped into something already built. Something waiting. Not for just anyone, but for someone who would notice. Someone who would listen. Someone who would care enough to uncover it. Joseph Davis had spent his entire life building things others could live in. But for the first time, he realized he might be standing inside something that had been built for him to find. And whatever this place truly was, whatever story it held beneath its worn boards and silent walls, it wasn't finished yet. Joseph didn't sleep much that night. The wind slipped through the cracks in the barn walls, whispering across the beams like a voice that refused to be ignored. But it wasn't the cold that kept him awake. It was the journal. He had placed it beside him, on the makeshift table he'd built from salvaged wood. Every few minutes his eyes drifted back to it, as if it might open on its own and reveal something he had missed. He had read only a portion of it before the light faded, but it was enough. Enough to understand that what lay hidden beneath the barn floor wasn't just forgotten storage, it was history, carefully buried, deliberately concealed, and now uncovered. By him. Joseph exhaled slowly, pushing himself upright. The sky outside was still dark, but the faintest hint of dawn hovered at the edge of the horizon. He reached for the journal. If there were answers, they wouldn't come from waiting. They would come from continuing. The handwriting inside the journal was steady, but worn by time. Each entry was dated, though the years stretched back far beyond anything Joseph had expected. Late 1800s, some entries even earlier. He read slowly, carefully, as if rushing might cause the words to disappear. At first, the passages seemed ordinary records of repairs, mentions of weather notes about livestock, the kind of details any property owner might keep. But then the tone shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. "We arrived just past midnight. No lanterns, no voices, only the signal." Joseph frowned slightly. Signal. He turned the page. 3 tonight. 1 injured. Hid them beneath the loft until the riders passed. His fingers tightened slightly on the edges of the paper. Another page. They are closer now. We must move them quicker. The barn cannot hold them long. Joseph leaned back, his breath slowing. It wasn't just a journal. It was a record of movement, of protection, of something dangerous. And then finally a word appeared that made everything fall into place. Another safe passage completed. May the Lord keep the path hidden. Safe passage. Joseph stared at the page, his mind piecing together what his instincts had already begun to suspect. This barn had once been part of something far greater than a farm. It had been a refuge, a hidden stop, a place where people desperate hunted and unseen had found shelter in the dead of night. The Underground Railroad. The realization settled into him slowly, like a weight that didn't crush, but anchored. This wasn't just history. This was courage, risk, sacrifice, lives that had passed through these walls without leaving a trace. until now. Joseph closed the journal carefully, his hands steadier than before. Because now he understood something else. If this place had been hidden once, there was a reason. And if it had stayed hidden for this long, there might be more. The barn felt different that morning. Not larger, not stronger, but deeper. As if every beam, every shadow, every creak of wood carried something unseen beneath it. Joseph moved slowly, his eyes scanning areas he had previously overlooked. If there was a passage, a place to hide people, there had to be more than just a floor compartment. His gaze drifted upward, toward the loft. He had reinforced parts of it already, but he hadn't fully explored it. The structure had seemed too unstable at first, too risky. Now it felt necessary. Joseph climbed the narrow ladder, carefully testing each rung before placing his weight on it. The wood groaned in protest, but held. At the top, the air felt heavier, thicker with dust and time. Loose hay crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the loft. From above the barn stretched out in quiet stillness the morning light, filtering through gaps in the roof like faint golden threads. Joseph moved toward the far end. Something about that corner had always felt off. Not broken, not damaged, just different. He knelt down, brushing aside old hay and debris. The wood beneath was smoother than the rest, less worn, more deliberate. His fingers traced along the edge, and then he felt it. A seam, barely visible, but there. Joseph's pulse slowed, not from fear, but from focus. He reached for the same pry tool he had used the day before and carefully worked it into the narrow line. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft click. Joseph paused, listened. Nothing. No movement outside. No sound but the distant wind. He pressed again. The panel shifted, not upward, but sideways, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for a person to pass through. Joseph exhaled slowly, then leaned forward and looked inside. Darkness, deeper than the space below the floor, but not empty. He could feel it, the same way he had felt the hollow beneath the plank. Presence, purpose. Joseph reached for a small flashlight from his toolbox and switched it on the beam, cutting through the darkness. What it revealed made him freeze. A room, hidden within the structure of the barn itself, not large, but carefully built, reinforced, protected. Shelves lined one wall, some broken, some still intact. On them rested objects untouched for decades. A wooden chest, old blankets, a lantern, and something else. Photographs. Joseph stepped inside, slowly, ducking slightly as he moved deeper into the hidden space. The air was stale but not suffocating. This place had been sealed, preserved, waiting. He approached the chest first, kneeling beside it. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing neatly arranged items within. Clothing, simple, worn, but folded with care. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, were more documents, thicker than the letters below, more official. Joseph unwrapped one carefully. His eyes scanned the page. Land records, ownership documents, signatures. Not just of the barn's original owner, but of others. Names connected to the journal. Names that had risked everything to keep this place hidden. Joseph swallowed slowly. This wasn't just a historical site. It was proof. Proof of something that had been erased from records, or buried beneath them. He stood slowly, his flashlight beam drifting across the room. Then it landed on the photographs. Joseph stepped closer. Black and white, faded, but unmistakable. Faces. Men, women, children, standing inside this very space, looking directly at the camera. Some smiling faintly, some not at all. All of them carrying something in their eyes that Joseph recognized immediately. Hope. Fragile, but real. He reached out his fingers, hovering just above one of the images. They made it, he whispered. Not all of them, but some. And this place had helped them do it. Joseph stepped back, his chest rising slowly as the weight of the discovery settled fully into him. This wasn't just a secret. It was a legacy. And now, it was his responsibility. Because if people like Douglas were interested in this land, if Ryan had come back looking for something, then all of this was in danger. Joseph turned his gaze steady now. He had come here to rebuild a broken barn, but he had found something far greater, something worth protecting. And for the first time since everything had been taken from him, Joseph Davis didn't just feel like a man starting over. He felt like a man standing guard. Joseph didn't tell anyone right away. Not Margaret Holloway. Not the curious neighbors who occasionally slowed their cars along Hollow Creek Road. Not even the quiet, knowing wind that seemed to carry whispers through the barn at night. Some discoveries demanded silence before they could be protected. And this one felt fragile. But silence didn't last long in a place where interest had already begun to grow. 3 days after Joseph uncovered the hidden room above the loft, a black SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road leading to the barn. It didn't belong. Joseph knew that before it even came into full view. The engine was too quiet, the body too polished. It moved with intention, not like a passerby, but like someone arriving for a purpose. Joseph stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands slowly on a cloth, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The SUV came to a stop just a few yards away. The driver's door opened. Douglas Whitaker stepped out. But he wasn't alone. 2 other men followed, both younger, both carrying themselves with the kind of casual alertness that spoke of hired muscle rather than friendly company. Joseph felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, recognition. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a move. Well, Douglas said, adjusting his coat as he approached his smile, smooth but hollow. Looks like you've been busy. Joseph didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make Douglas aware that this wasn't going to go the way he expected. I've been working, Joseph said finally. Douglas glanced around the property, taking in the subtle improvements, the reinforced beams, the straightened door, the cleared space. A shame, he said lightly. All that effort. For something that won't last. Joseph's gaze didn't waver. That depends on who's trying to make it fall. For a brief moment, Douglas's smile faltered. Then it returned sharper this time. I'll get straight to the point, he said. I want this property. Joseph folded his arms. It's not mine to sell. Douglas waved a dismissive hand. Margaret's old. She'll sell eventually. Everyone does. I'm offering you a chance to walk away with something before that happens. Joseph shook his head slowly. No. The word landed with quiet certainty. Douglas's eyes darkened. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Joseph took a small step forward. No, he said again. You are. The 2 men behind Douglas shifted slightly, not aggressive yet, but ready. Joseph noticed, and he understood. This wasn't just pressure. It was escalation. Douglas exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. You don't understand what you're sitting on, he said, his voice lowering. This land, it has potential. Development potential. I can turn this entire area into something profitable, something useful. Joseph's expression didn't change. It's already useful. Douglas let out a short, humorless laugh. For what nostalgia, broken wood, and empty space? Joseph held his gaze. For something you wouldn't recognize even if it was standing right in front of you. Silence fell. Heavy. Charged. Douglas studied him for a long moment. Then slowly his smile returned, but this time it carried something colder. Fine, he said. We'll do this the long way. He turned back toward the SUV, but before getting in, he paused. And when that barn collapses, he added without looking back, remember that I offered you a way out. The doors slammed, the engine started, And just like that, they were gone. But the air they left behind felt different, heavier, less forgiving. Joseph didn't move for a long time. He stood there watching the dust settle his mind, moving through everything that had just happened. This wasn't about land anymore. Not really. Douglas knew something. Maybe not everything. But enough to push this far. Enough to bring people with him. And that meant one thing. Time was no longer on Joseph's side. Later that afternoon, Joseph made his way to Margaret Holloway's house. It was a modest place set back from the road, surrounded by aging trees that seemed to lean inward as if guarding it. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. "I was wondering when you'd come by," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Joseph paused. You knew Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. "I've lived here a long time, Joseph. I can tell when something's changed." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Joseph reached into his coat and carefully pulled out one of the documents he had found in the hidden room. He handed it to her. Margaret took it slowly, her eyes scanning the page. At first, her expression was neutral. Then it shifted. Her brow furrowed. Her lips parted slightly. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. Joseph met her gaze. "In the barn." Silence filled the room. Margaret sat down slowly, the paper still in her hands. "I knew there were stories," she said after a moment. "My grandfather used to talk about the barn, said it was important. But I thought—" She shook her head. "I thought it was just old folklore." "It's not," Joseph said. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes sharper now. "What else did you find?" Joseph hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because saying it out loud made it real. "More documents," he said. "Photographs. A hidden room." Margaret's breath caught slightly. "A hidden—" Joseph nodded. "It's not just a barn," he continued. "It never was." Margaret leaned back in her chair, the weight of it settling over her. "And Douglas?" she asked quietly. Joseph's expression darkened slightly. "He knows enough to want it," he said. "And he's not going to stop." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was something different there. Not uncertainty, not fear, resolve. "He's been trying to buy this land for years," she said. "Offered more money than it's worth. I always refused because something didn't feel right." She looked down at the document in her hands. "Now I know why." Joseph nodded. "We need to protect it." Margaret met his gaze. "Then we do it properly," she said. "No more guessing. No more hiding." Joseph frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Margaret stood moving toward a small desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old address book. "There's someone you need to meet," she said. "A historian. Young but thorough. She's been researching local records for years, things most people ignore." She flipped through the pages, then tapped a name. Hannah Brooks. Joseph watched her carefully. "You trust her?" Margaret nodded. "She cares about the truth," she said simply. "And right now, that's exactly what we need." As Joseph stepped back out into the fading light, the world felt different. Clearer. More defined. This was no longer just his fight. It was bigger than him. Bigger than Douglas. Bigger even than the town that had laughed at him. This was about something that had been hidden for generations. Something that had survived because people had chosen to protect it. And now, that responsibility had passed to him. Joseph looked back toward the barn in the distance, its worn silhouette standing quietly against the horizon. To everyone else, it was still broken, still worthless, still something to laugh at. But Joseph knew the truth. And soon, so would everyone else. Joseph arrived at Margaret Holloway's house the next morning, just after sunrise, the early light stretching across the fields like a quiet promise. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It was the kind of morning that felt calm on the surface, but beneath it something was shifting. Margaret was already waiting on the porch. "She's coming," Margaret said without greeting. "I called her last night. Didn't say much, just enough." Joseph nodded. "You trust her?" Margaret's gaze held steady. "I trust what she stands for." That was enough. Hannah Brooks arrived an hour later in a dusty blue sedan that looked as if it had seen more back roads than highways. She stepped out with a canvas satchel slung across her shoulder, her movements quick but grounded. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a loose knot and eyes that missed very little. She glanced once at Joseph, once at Margaret, and then toward the barn in the distance. "That's it?" she asked. Joseph nodded. Hannah's lips pressed together slightly. "Not in doubt, but in recognition. I've heard stories," she said quietly. "Most people dismiss them. Most people didn't look." Joseph replied. That earned him a brief glance, measured, respectful. "Then let's look," she said. The three of them walked toward the barn together. For Joseph, the path felt different this time. Not just a return to a place he had been restoring, but a return to something that was beginning to reveal itself. Hannah stepped inside first. She paused just past the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the filtered light, scanning the structure, not as a builder would, but as someone trained to read the past through what remained. She moved slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the beams, the walls, the floor. "Original structure's older than it looks," she murmured. "Mid-1800s, maybe earlier. Reinforcements added later. But not by professionals. By necessity." Joseph watched her closely. "You can tell that just from this?" he asked. Hannah gave a faint smile. "History leaves patterns. You just have to know how to read them." Joseph nodded toward the section of the floor where he had found the hidden compartment. "There's more," he said. When Hannah saw the letters, the tools, the map, and finally the journal, her composure shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. She sat down slowly on a wooden crate, carefully unfolding one of the letters, her hands steady but deliberate. The room fell quiet. Joseph and Margaret watched as Hannah read page after page, her expression tightening, softening, then sharpening again. Finally, she exhaled. "This isn't just documentation," she said. "This is primary evidence." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Of what Hannah looked up. Of a hidden route," she said. "A verified stop. Not just rumored, proven." Joseph's gaze darkened slightly. "The Underground Railroad," he said. Hannah nodded. "Yes," she replied. "But more than that." She reached for the map, laying it flat across the crate. "These routes, these markings, they don't match the commonly recorded paths," she explained. "This suggests an alternate network, one that wasn't documented or was intentionally erased." Margaret's breath caught. "Erased," she repeated. Hannah met her eyes. "History isn't always preserved," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's buried, sometimes it's rewritten, and sometimes it's hidden by the people who lived it because it had to be." Joseph glanced toward the loft. "There's a room," he said. "Hidden." Hannah didn't hesitate. "Show me." Climbing up into the loft felt different now. Not just a discovery, a confirmation. When Joseph slid the hidden panel aside and the narrow opening revealed itself once more, Hannah didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and entered. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the room piece by piece. The shelves, the chest, the photographs, the preserved stillness of a place untouched for generations. Hannah stopped in the center of the room. Slowly she turned, taking it all in. Then she whispered almost to herself, "My God." Joseph stood just behind her. "It's real," he said quietly. Hannah nodded, her eyes moving from one object to the next. "It's more than real," she replied. "It's intact." She moved toward the photographs, first lifting one carefully. "These people," she murmured. They weren't supposed to be remembered like this. Joseph frowned slightly. What do you mean? Hannah looked at him. Most of the Underground Railroad wasn't recorded in detail, she explained. For safety, for survival. Names were changed, paths were hidden. Evidence was minimal by design. She gestured around the room. But this, she said, this is rare. This is a complete fragment, a preserved record of a place that wasn't meant to be found. Margaret stepped closer, her voice softer now. Then why hide it so well? Hannah's gaze lingered on the chest. Because if it had been found at the time, she said everyone involved would have been in danger. And later, maybe no one wanted to reopen something that complicated. Joseph crossed his arms slowly. Or someone wanted to keep it hidden, he said. Hannah glanced at him. Yes, she said, that too. They spent hours inside that room, cataloging, documenting, carefully examining each piece of evidence. Hannah took notes, her handwriting quick but precise. She photographed everything she could without disturbing the original placement more than necessary. By the time they stepped back out into the open air, the sun had already begun its descent. The world outside felt smaller somehow, less important. Joseph leaned against the side of the barn, his arms folded, his eyes distant. So what does this mean? He asked. Hannah hesitated. Because the answer wasn't simple. It means this place is significant, she said. Historically, legally, potentially even nationally. Margaret's brow furrowed. Legally, she asked. Hannah nodded. If the land contains verified historical artifacts tied to a protected narrative, she explained it can qualify for preservation status. That changes everything. Joseph's gaze sharpened. Including ownership, he asked. Hannah met his eyes. Yes, she said. Including ownership. The implications settled slowly, but heavily. Because now Douglas Whitaker's interest made sense. This wasn't just land, it was value, not just in money but in control. Control over something that could redefine the property. Joseph exhaled slowly. He's not going to stop, he said. Hannah shook her head. No, she agreed. He won't. Margaret straightened slightly, her voice firm now. Then we don't give him the chance, she said. Joseph looked at her. How? Margaret turned to Hannah. What do we need to do? Hannah didn't hesitate this time. We document everything she said. We file for historical review. We bring this into the open properly, legally, and completely. Joseph's jaw tightened slightly. That's going to attract attention, he said. Hannah nodded. Yes, she said. But it also creates protection. Margaret placed a hand on the edge of the barn, her fingers brushing against the weathered wood. This place stayed hidden because it had to, she said quietly. But now, maybe it needs to be seen. Joseph looked at the barn, really looked at it, at everything it had been, everything it had protected, everything it still held. And for the first time, he understood something clearly. This wasn't just about defending a structure. It was about revealing a truth. And once that truth was out, there would be no going back. Joseph straightened slowly, his voice calm but resolute. Then we do it, he said. Hannah nodded. Margaret didn't hesitate. And just like that, the fight changed. No longer hidden, no longer quiet. Now, it was coming into the light. The word treasure traveled faster than the truth. By the end of the week, the story had already twisted itself into something unrecognizable. At the diner, people spoke in excited whispers, heard the old man found gold, buried money maybe, Civil War stuff, or something illegal. Why else would it be hidden? Speculation fed curiosity, curiosity fed attention, and attention brought pressure. Joseph noticed the shift immediately. Cars slowed more often along Hollow Creek Road. Strangers' faces he didn't recognize started appearing at the edge of the property, pretending to admire the landscape, while their eyes lingered on the barn. Even the laughter had changed. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was calculating. And that Joseph knew was far more dangerous. Inside the barn, the truth sat quietly unchanged by rumor. The letters, the journal, the photographs, the hidden room. The story they told wasn't about gold or money. It was about people, lives, risk, courage that had no price tag. But that didn't mean it had no value. Hannah made that clear the moment she returned with a stack of documents and a folder thick with notes. "This isn't just historically significant," she said, laying everything out carefully on the makeshift table. "It's legally protected once we establish it properly." Joseph leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean exactly?" Hannah met his eyes. "It means this land can't just be bought and developed like any other property," she explained. "If it's recognized as a historical site, it falls under preservation law. That changes ownership rights, usage rights, everything." Margaret, standing nearby, folded her arms. "And Douglas?" she asked. Hannah didn't hesitate. "He loses control," she said simply. That answer hung in the air longer than expected, because it explained everything. The offers, the pressure, the sudden urgency. Douglas Whitaker hadn't been guessing. He had known. Maybe not the full story, but enough. Enough to try to claim it before anyone else could. Later that afternoon, Joseph found himself sitting alone just outside the barn, the journal resting in his hands. The pages felt heavier now, not physically, but with meaning. He turned slowly to an entry he had read the night before. "We move them tonight. The river crossing is unsafe, but we cannot wait. Better to risk the water than the riders." Joseph exhaled softly. They had risked everything. Not for wealth, not for recognition, but for something far more fragile. Freedom. He looked up at the barn, at the structure people still called worthless, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride, not satisfaction, responsibility. Because whatever this place was, whatever it had been, it had survived long enough to reach him, and now it depended on him. That night the pressure came closer. Joseph had just finished securing a section of the outer wall when he heard it. Footsteps, not approaching from the road. From the side. Slow, careful, deliberate. Joseph didn't turn right away. He set his tools down quietly, his body still, his ears focused. Another step, then another. He turned. 2 men stood just beyond the edge of the light spilling from the barn. Not Douglas this time, but the same kind of presence, the same kind of intention. "You're trespassing," Joseph said calmly. One of them smirked. "Just looking," he replied. Joseph's gaze didn't waver. "You've seen enough." The second man stepped forward slightly. "Heard there's something valuable here," he said. "Thought we'd check it out." Joseph took a slow step forward. "There's nothing here for you." The first man laughed quietly. "Everything's for someone," he said. "Just depends who gets to it first." Joseph felt the tension shift. This wasn't curiosity. This was probing, testing, seeing how far they could go. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, but his posture changed, subtle, firm, unmoving. "You leave now," he said. The silence that followed stretched tight. Then after a moment the men exchanged a glance and stepped back. "Won't stay hidden forever," one of them muttered as they turned away. Joseph watched them go. Didn't relax until their footsteps disappeared completely. The next morning he found fresh marks near the side of the barn, scratches, attempts. Someone had tried to force entry during the night. They hadn't succeeded, but they had tried. Joseph stood there for a long time staring at the damage. Because now the situation was clear. This wasn't just interest, it was escalation. By the time Hannah arrived that afternoon, Joseph had already made a decision. "We move faster," he said, as soon as she stepped out of her car. Hannah nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Margaret joined them a moment later, her expression tight. "I heard what happened last night," she said. Word spreading. Joseph crossed his arms. Then we don't let rumors control the story, he said. We tell it ourselves. Hannah's eyes sharpened. That's risky, she said. Once it's public, there's no turning back. Joseph met her gaze. There's no turning back now. They gathered inside the barn, the documents spread out before them. For the first time, everything was laid bare. Not hidden, not protected by silence, but ready to be seen. Hannah organized the materials with precision. The letters establish presence, she said. The journal provides narrative. The photographs confirm identity and continuity. And the land records, she held one up, prove ownership and usage history. Margaret exhaled slowly. That's everything. Hannah nodded. It's more than enough. Joseph looked at the collection, at the story it told, at the lives it represented. And for a moment he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not doubt, clarity. Because the treasure everyone was talking about wasn't gold, wasn't money, wasn't anything that could be spent or traded. It was truth, preserved, hidden, now uncovered. And that truth was worth more than anything Douglas Whitaker could ever offer. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Joseph stood at the entrance of the barn. The same place where people had once laughed, where they had pointed, judged, dismissed. He looked out across the land, the quiet fields, the distant road, the town that had never expected anything from him. And he understood something deeply finally. They had never been wrong about one thing. He had nothing when he arrived. No home, no support, no place in their world. But now, he held something they didn't, something they couldn't take. Not with threats, not with money, not with force. Because some things, once revealed, could never be buried again. Joseph turned back toward the barn, his expression steady. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quiet. And it certainly wouldn't be fair. But it would be worth it. Because this time, he wasn't just rebuilding something. He was protecting something that had already survived far worse. The town hall had never been so full. People who hadn't attended a meeting in years now crowded into the worn wooden seats, their voices overlapping in restless waves of curiosity and tension. Some came because of the rumors. Others came because of the name Joseph Davis, now spoken with a mix of skepticism and fascination. And a few came because they already knew something important was about to surface. At the front of the room beneath the faded American flag, a long table had been set. Joseph stood beside it, not at the center, not demanding attention, just present, steady. Margaret Holloway sat to his right, her posture firm, despite the quiet storm of whispers around her. On his left, Hannah Brooks carefully arranged documents, photographs and copies of the journal entries, each piece placed with deliberate care. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Douglas Whitaker entered last. He didn't rush, didn't look around in surprise like the others. He walked in as if he already owned the room. But his eyes, they betrayed something. A flicker. Not fear, but awareness. Because he understood what this was, and what it could become. He took a seat near the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ryan Davis arrived shortly after. He didn't sit near Joseph, didn't even acknowledge him at first. He chose a seat along the side wall, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed forward. But inside something churned. Because deep down, Ryan knew this wasn't going to end the way he had planned. The meeting began with routine formalities, names, procedures, order. But the air was too thick with anticipation for any of it to matter. Finally, the floor was opened, and Joseph stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't clear his throat for attention. He simply began. "I wasn't looking for anything when I came here," he said. The room quieted, not because of volume, but because of tone. Honest. Unforced. "I came because I had nowhere else to go," he continued. "I rented a broken barn from Mrs. Holloway. I fixed what I could, stayed out of the way." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Joseph let them pass, but while repairing the floor, he said, "I found something." He stepped aside slightly. Hannah moved forward, lifting one of the photographs for the room to see. "This," she said, "is part of what was hidden inside that barn." She didn't rush, didn't dramatize. She explained. Clearly, carefully. The letters, the journal, the hidden room. The evidence of a forgotten route, one that connected the barn to a network that had once risked everything for people seeking freedom. As she spoke, the room changed. The whispers faded. The skepticism softened. Because what they were hearing wasn't speculation. It was truth, documented, preserved, undeniable. Margaret then stood, her voice steady. "My family owned that land for generations," she said. "We were told stories, but we didn't know. Not like this." She looked around the room. "And now we do." When the documents were laid out, copies passed among the town officials, the shift became undeniable. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't exaggeration. This was evidence, and it carried weight. Legal weight, historical weight, moral weight. Joseph stepped forward again. "I'm not here to sell anything," he said. "I'm not here to make money from this. I'm here because this place means something." His gaze moved slowly across the room. To people who risked their lives, he continued. To stories that were never told. To history that almost disappeared. His voice remained calm, but the words landed. "And now," he said, "it's our responsibility to decide what happens next." Silence followed. Not empty, but full. Full of realization, of shifting perspective, of something larger than any single person in that room. Then, a chair scraped sharply against the floor. Douglas Whitaker stood, slowly, deliberately. "Well," he said, his voice smooth but edged, "that's quite a story." The tension snapped back into place. Joseph didn't move, didn't react. Douglas stepped forward. "But stories don't change ownership," he continued. "They don't override legal rights, and they certainly don't stop development." Hannah met his gaze. "Actually," she said, "in this case they do." Douglas smiled faintly. "I doubt that." Hannah didn't flinch. "The evidence presented qualifies the property for historical preservation status," she said, "under state and federal guidelines that limits any commercial development. It also triggers a review of prior land transactions." The room stirred. Douglas's expression tightened just slightly. "Meaning?" he asked. Hannah's voice remained steady. "Meaning, if any part of this land was acquired under misrepresentation, coercion, or concealed information," she said, "those transactions can be challenged." A ripple moved through the crowd. Because now, it wasn't just about history. It was about accountability. All eyes turned to Douglas. For the first time since entering the room, he hesitated. Only for a second. But it was enough. Ryan shifted in his seat, his face pale. Because he understood what was coming next. Joseph didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was already doing the work. Margaret stepped forward. "For years," she said, "I was pressured to sell that land. Offers that didn't make sense. Urgency that didn't feel right." She looked directly at Douglas. "Now I understand why." Douglas's jaw tightened. "You have no proof of wrongdoing," he said. Hannah lifted another document. "Actually," she replied, "we do." She placed it on the table. A land record, signed, dated, connected, not just to ownership, but to intent. The room fell completely silent. Because in that moment, everything shifted. Douglas Whitaker wasn't the man offering opportunity anymore. He was the man hiding something. Ryan stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice strained. "You're twisting things, making assumptions." Joseph turned his head slightly. Not sharply, not angrily. Just enough. Ryan's voice faltered. Because for the first time, he saw something in his father he hadn't seen before. Not weakness, Not hesitation, strength, quiet, unshakable. You signed those papers, Ryan added, but the conviction was gone. Joseph met his gaze. Yes, he said. A pause. But I didn't sign away the truth. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, closed. He sat back down, because there was nothing left to argue. The town officials conferred quietly. Documents passed, words exchanged, and then the decision came. The property located on Hollow Creek Road, one of them announced, is hereby placed under provisional historical review. A breath seemed to leave the entire room at once. Pending full verification, the official continued all development activity is suspended. Douglas's face went still. Further, the official added previous transactions involving adjacent land parcels will be reviewed. And just like that, it was over. Not the story, not the consequences, but the control, the narrative, the power. Douglas Whitaker had come to claim something, and left with nothing. The room remained quiet as people began to stand, not with excitement, not with celebration, but with something deeper, respect, because they had seen something they hadn't expected, a man they had mocked, dismissed, overlooked, stand in front of them not with anger, but with truth. Joseph didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply gathered the documents, stepped back, and allowed the moment to settle. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about restoring something that had been buried. And now, it had been seen. In the weeks that followed the town hall meeting, something remarkable began to happen. Not all at once, and not loudly, but steadily, like the careful rebuilding Joseph Davis understood better than most. The laughter disappeared first. It didn't fade gradually. It stopped. People who had once slowed their cars to smirk now slowed for a different reason. They looked longer, more thoughtfully, as if trying to reconcile the broken barn they had mocked with the truth they had witnessed. Because once truth is seen, it changes the way everything else is remembered. The barn itself became something new, not instantly restored, not transformed into perfection, but respected. Hannah Brooks returned often sometimes with colleagues, historians, preservation specialists, archivists. They came not to take over, but to understand, to document every beam, every hidden space, every artifact that had survived quietly for generations. Each photograph was catalogued, each letter preserved, each entry in the journal carefully transcribed, and slowly word spread beyond the town. Not rumors this time. Recognition. The State Historical Office initiated a full review. Experts confirmed what Hannah had already known. The barn on Hollow Creek Road was officially designated a site of historical significance, not because of wealth, not because of architecture, but because of what it had sheltered, what it had protected, what it had remembered. Joseph didn't change much. He still woke early, still worked with his hands, still moved through the barn with the same quiet focus he had always carried. But something inside him had shifted. Not outwardly, not in a way most people would notice, but deeply. For the first time since losing everything in the city, Joseph no longer felt like a man starting over. He felt like a man who had found something worth continuing. Margaret Holloway stood beside him through it all. She handled the legal processes with a calm determination no one in town had fully appreciated before. The land was formally protected under preservation law, ensuring it could never be sold for development, not to Douglas Whitaker, not to anyone. When the final paperwork was signed, Margaret looked out at the barn and said quietly, "My grandfather was right." Joseph glanced at her. "He always said this place mattered," she continued. "I just didn't know how much." Joseph nodded. "Now we do." Douglas Whitaker disappeared from town within a month. There were no announcements, no explanations, just absence. But his influence lingered. Investigations into his land dealings had begun quietly, triggered by the very documents he had tried to suppress. The same evidence he had dismissed in that crowded room had unraveled more than just his plans. It had exposed a pattern, and patterns once revealed rarely stay hidden. Joseph didn't follow the details. He didn't need to, because some forms of justice don't require witness. They simply happen. Ryan Davis returned one last time. He didn't arrive in a polished car this time, didn't carry himself with the same sharp confidence. He walked up the dirt road slowly, his steps uncertain, his posture heavier than before. Joseph was repairing a section of the outer wall when he saw him. He didn't stop working, but he didn't ignore him either. Ryan stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground for a long moment before finally speaking. "I saw the news," he said quietly. Joseph nodded once. Silence stretched between them. Then Ryan exhaled. "I didn't know," he admitted. Joseph set his tools down slowly. "No," he said. "You didn't." Ryan swallowed. I thought I was doing what made sense," he continued, "selling the house, moving forward. I didn't think—" His voice faltered. Joseph turned to face him fully. "You didn't think about what it meant to take something from someone who trusted you?" He said, not harshly, not angrily, but clearly. Ryan's eyes lifted slightly. For the first time, there was no defense in them, only recognition. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Joseph studied him for a moment, not searching for perfection, not expecting transformation, just listening. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said. Another silence followed. Different this time. Less sharp, less heavy. "I don't expect things to go back," Ryan added quietly. "They won't," Joseph replied. Ryan nodded. "I figured." He hesitated, then took a small step back. "But I wanted to say it anyway." Joseph didn't respond right away. Then, finally, "That's enough," he said. "Not forgiveness, not rejection, something else. A boundary, clear, honest, earned." Ryan accepted it. He turned, walking back the way he came, not as a man in control, but as someone who had finally understood what control had cost him. Joseph watched him go. Not with regret, not with anger, just with clarity. By early spring, the barn had taken on a new life, not polished, not commercialized, but purposeful. Part of it remained exactly as it had been discovered, the hidden room preserved, protected, untouched, except for careful documentation. Another section became a small historical space, simple displays, copies of the documents, photographs arranged in quiet rows. And one part, Joseph kept for himself. A workshop. Not grand, not modern, but alive. The sound of tools returned to the space, not as echoes of the past, but as continuation. He began teaching again. Not formally, not advertised. But people came. Young men who had never held a hammer properly. Older ones who had forgotten what it meant to build something with their hands. Even a few who had once laughed. Joseph didn't turn them away, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. People change. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes only after they've been forced to see. But they do. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the fields, casting long golden light across the barn, Joseph stood at the entrance. The same place where it had all begun. The same place where laughter had once followed him. Now it was quiet. Not empty, but peaceful. Hannah approached a folder tucked under her arm. "It's official," she said, handing him a document. "Full historical designation. Protected. Recognized." Joseph took it, glancing briefly at the words, before looking back up. "Thank you," he said. Hannah smiled faintly. "You did the hard part," she replied. Joseph shook his head. "No," he said. "I just found it." Hannah looked at the barn. "At the right time," she said. Joseph stood there long after she left, watching the light fade, listening to the quiet. And for the first time in years, he felt something settle inside him. Not the absence of loss, not the erasure of pain, but something stronger, peace. because the world had taken everything from him once, his home, his family, his place, but it hadn't taken what mattered most. And in the end, that was the only thing that had allowed him to rebuild. Not just a barn, not just a life, but something far more lasting. A truth, a legacy, a reminder that a man is never defined by where he falls, but by what he chooses to protect when he stands again.